The temperature was 11 degrees below zero when Master Chief Marcus Hale pulled his truck off the icy road along the Blackwater River in rural Virginia. He had driven this route every morning for 3 years since leaving the Navy, and he had never once stopped. But something made him stop that morning. He saw a shape half buried in the snow at the river's edge, dark, still, and barely breathing. When he climbed down the embankment and knelt beside it, he found a German shepherd, a full-grown male, his muzzle foam-flecked and his legs trembling in shallow, desperate spasms. Someone had poisoned this dog and left him to die alone in the cold. Marcus stripped off his outer jacket, wrapped the dog in it without hesitation, and drove 40 minutes through ice-covered roads to the nearest emergency animal clinic. He sat in the waiting room for 4 hours without moving, his hands clasped, his jaw set, the same expression he had worn during 2 combat deployments and a rescue mission in the Hindu Kush. When the veterinarian walked out and told him the dog had survived, Marcus exhaled for what felt like the first time that morning. He named the dog River. And River, it turned out, was not finished making miracles. What Marcus could not have known in that frozen moment was that this dog would become the bridge between a broken veteran and the life she thought she had permanently lost. Have you ever witnessed something, an animal, a stranger, a single moment, that changed the entire direction of your life? Keep watching, because this story will make you believe it's possible. Captain Serena Voss had spent 11 years in the United States Army. 4 of those years as a military intelligence officer assigned to high-value target operations in Afghanistan and later in the Horn of Africa. She had been the kind of officer who slept 4 hours a night without complaint, who memorized operational maps the way other people memorize song lyrics, who could read a room full of foreign nationals and assess threat probability before anyone else had finished their coffee. She was precise, disciplined, and deeply respected by every enlisted soldier who ever served under her command. Her commanding general had written in one evaluation that Captain Voss possessed the rarest combination of analytical brilliance and emotional intelligence he had seen in 27 years of service. She had believed in her mission completely. She had believed that the work she did mattered, that the intelligence she gathered saved lives, and that every sacrifice she made in service of that work was justified by the outcome. Then the outcome changed. During her final deployment in 2019, a mission she had coordinated based on what she believed was airtight intelligence went catastrophically wrong. A compound they had assessed as housing a high-value insurgent turned out to shelter a family. 3 children were injured in the initial breach before the team realized the error. No one died. The soldiers responded with immediate medical care. But Serena had been the one who had signed off on the targeting assessment. She had been the one who had looked at the satellite imagery and the informant's testimony and said, with total confidence, that the compound was clear of civilians. The official investigation concluded that the intelligence failure stemmed from a compromised local source and that Captain Voss had followed proper protocol. She was cleared of any wrongdoing. But protocol does not live in the same place as a conscience, and no official clearance can reach far enough into a person's chest to remove what has already lodged itself there permanently. Serena requested separation from the Army 6 months later. She moved back to Virginia, rented a small house near the Shenandoah Valley, and began the long, disorienting process of becoming a civilian. She had no roadmap for this territory. In the Army, every hour had a purpose. Every decision had a chain of command. Every morning had a structure that told you exactly where to place your feet. In the house near the valley, the mornings were just silence, and silence, for Serena Voss, had become the loudest and most unbearable sound she had ever known. For the first 8 months after her separation, Serena managed her days through sheer force of the habits she had built over 11 years. She woke at 5, ran 4 miles regardless of weather, ate strategically, and kept her house with the kind of order that looked almost aggressive to anyone who visited. Her sister came twice and remarked that the house looked like a field operations center. Serena had laughed at that, but the laugh had not reached her eyes. Beneath the rigid structure, something was eroding. She had begun waking in the middle of the night with her heart hammering against her sternum, replaying the mission briefing in the kind of granular detail that only trauma can produce. She saw the imagery. She heard her own voice giving the assessment. She felt the absolute certainty she had carried into that decision, and then she felt the moment that certainty shattered. She had sought help through the VA, attended a group counseling session twice, and stopped going after the second meeting because sitting in a circle talking about her feelings felt like a violation of everything her training had built inside her. She was not arrogant about this. She simply did not yet understand that asking for help requires the same courage as any combat operation, and that the enemy she was fighting now could not be defeated through isolation and discipline alone. She had started volunteering at a local animal shelter in October, primarily because it gave her somewhere to be during the hours between 3 and 6 in the afternoon, which she had identified as the most dangerous window in her day. The shelter director, a warm and perpetually exhausted woman named Donna, had put Serena to work immediately without asking too many questions, which Serena deeply appreciated. She cleaned kennels, administered medications, walked dogs in rotation, and occasionally sat on the concrete floor of a run just to keep a frightened animal company. She was good with the animals in the same way she had been good with her soldiers: calm, consistent, and honest. Animals, like enlisted personnel, could sense when someone was performing composure rather than possessing it. Serena was still performing, but she was also, quietly and without realizing it, beginning to heal. It was in this shelter that Marcus Hale brought River 4 days after pulling him from the riverbank. The dog had stabilized at the emergency clinic but required monitored care during his recovery, and the clinic had referred Marcus to the shelter's medical wing. Marcus had visited every day that first week, and by the second week he had met Serena during her afternoon shift. Marcus Hale was 53 years old and built like someone had assembled him specifically for difficult situations. He had retired from the Navy as a Master Chief after 24 years, the last 8 of which had been spent with SEAL Team 8. He was not a man who spoke often, but when he did, the words arrived with a weight and specificity that made people listen. He had noticed Serena during his second visit to the shelter because she was the only volunteer who approached River without any performance of affection. Most people who visited recovering animals tended to project emotion onto them, cooing, treating them like props for their own comfort. Serena had sat down 3 feet from River's kennel, said nothing for 5 minutes, and waited for the dog to make the first move. River had pressed his nose against the kennel door and inhaled her scent for a long time before finally resting his chin on his paws in a posture that indicated, unmistakably, acceptance. Marcus had watched this from the hallway and recognized the approach immediately. It was the same patience he had used during sensitive source development operations. No pressure, no performance, just presence. He introduced himself that afternoon. They talked for 20 minutes about River's prognosis, about the shelter's intake protocols, and eventually about their respective service histories. Neither of them made a big production of their military backgrounds. It came up the way it always does between veterans, naturally, efficiently, and with the particular shorthand that only people who have served can recognize in each other. Marcus had noticed the careful blankness in Serena's expression when the conversation touched on the end of her service, and he had filed it away without pressing. He understood that territory. He had walked through it himself. When River was cleared for foster placement 2 weeks later, Marcus had taken him home without hesitation. But he had also asked Donna if there was a formal dog training volunteer program at the shelter because he had an idea of forming. Donna had said yes, adding that they desperately needed someone to lead it since their previous trainer had moved out of state. Marcus had looked down the hallway toward the afternoon shift, where Serena was methodically refilling water bowls with the focused attention of someone defusing ordnance. And he had said he thought he might know someone. Serena agreed to lead the training program the same way she had agreed to most things in her post-service life, because filling time was still better than not filling it, and because she had, in truth, found something in her work with the shelter animals that she had not been able to name yet, but could feel in her chest like a slow, returning warmth. The program she designed was thorough. She approached dog training the same way she had approached intelligence operations, with clear objectives, measurable outcomes, and an understanding that the relationship between handler and animal was built entirely on trust established through consistent behavior over time. She trained 6 shelter volunteers over the first month, teaching them not just commands and techniques, but the underlying principles of animal psychology, the importance of reading body language, and the way that anxiety in the handler transferred directly into the animal being trained. She was a rigorous instructor, but she was not harsh. She had learned, through years of leading soldiers in high-pressure environments, that people perform best when they understand the why behind every directive, not just the what. The volunteers responded to her with the same instinctive respect her soldiers had shown her, and Serena felt the familiar and deeply missed satisfaction of watching people grow under her guidance. River was her primary training subject during this period. Marcus brought him to the shelter 3 mornings a week, and Serena worked with the dog daily. River was exceptional, intelligent, responsive, and possessed of a particular emotional sensitivity that Serena had not expected. He seemed to register the emotional states of the people around him with an accuracy that sometimes felt unsettling. When one of the younger volunteers, a 22-year-old named Priya who had recently lost her mother, arrived one morning visibly struggling, River had broken from a training exercise, walked directly to Priya, and pressed himself against her legs with quiet, undemanding steadiness until she had gathered herself. Serena had watched this and said nothing for a moment. Then she had turned back to the training group and told them that what they had just witnessed was not a distraction or a training failure. It was a demonstration of what they were ultimately working toward, an animal trained well enough and trusted deeply enough to exercise its own judgment in service of a human being's genuine need. The volunteers had been quiet after that, in the way people are quiet when something true has just been said. It was Marcus who first suggested the idea of a formal veteran support program, pairing shelter dogs in training with veterans experiencing transition difficulties. He had been thinking about it for weeks, had researched existing models across the country, and had sat with the idea long enough to understand what made this particular shelter uniquely positioned. The combination of River's instincts and Serena's understanding of both military culture and animal behavior was something he had not seen replicated anywhere else in his research. He presented the idea to Serena on a Thursday morning in February while they were walking River along the field behind the shelter. Serena had listened without interrupting, which Marcus recognized as the veteran's form of serious attention. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said that the program would need a structured intake process, a clearly defined therapeutic framework, measurable outcomes, and a partnership with the VA to ensure proper psychological support was available alongside the animal component. She had said all of this with her eyes on the middle distance, already building the architecture of the thing in her mind. Marcus had smiled and said that sounded like a yes. Serena had almost smiled back. The first cohort of the program, which they named River Protocol after their founding inspiration, included 7 veterans, 5 men and 2 women, ranging in age from 24 to 51, representing 4 branches of service and a wide spectrum of transition challenges. Serena had co-designed the curriculum with a licensed clinical psychologist named Dr. Amara Osei, who had extensive experience working with military populations and who immediately understood what Serena was building. The program was 12 weeks long. Each participant was paired with a shelter dog they would train using the same methodology Serena had developed with her volunteers, but embedded within a framework that explicitly connected the principles of animal training to the principles of personal recovery. Trust built through consistent behavior, progress measured in small and verifiable increments, the understanding that setbacks were data rather than failures, and the recognition that vulnerability, in both the handler and the animal, was not a weakness but the very foundation on which genuine connection was constructed. Serena led every session herself. She stood in front of these veterans, these people who understood, in their bones, the particular loneliness of coming home to a world that did not speak their language, and she taught them through the dogs what she was simultaneously teaching herself. She had not planned it that way, but the most powerful lessons rarely arrive on schedule. The program's third participant to complete the 12 weeks was a 26-year-old Marine veteran named Deja Watkins who had served 2 tours as a logistics specialist, had been medically separated after a vehicle accident that left her with chronic pain and a traumatic brain injury, and who had arrived at River Protocol barely making eye contact and speaking in responses so minimal they barely qualified as conversation. Deja had been paired with a 2-year-old mixed shepherd named Colt, a high-energy, easily distracted animal that the shelter staff had essentially given up on placing because his impulsivity made him difficult to manage. Serena had paired them deliberately. She had seen something in Deja's file, and something in Colt's behavior that suggested they were operating from the same internal landscape, both of them carrying more energy and capability than their current circumstances were allowing them to express. Both of them misread as problems when they were actually just waiting for the right framework. The pairing had been difficult at first. Colt's erratic behavior frustrated Deja, who had little patience for inconsistency in her post-injury state, and there were 2 sessions in the first month where Deja had left early, her jaw tight and her eyes bright with the particular anger of someone who feels themselves failing at something they cannot afford to fail at. Serena had followed her outside both times. She had not delivered speeches. She had sat beside Deja on the bench outside the shelter door and talked about her own mission failure in Afghanistan, not as a confession or a catharsis, but as a piece of information shared between 2 people who needed to understand each other. She had told Deja that the hardest thing she had ever learned was that a failed outcome does not define the quality of the person who faced it. She had told her that Colt was not rejecting her. He was waiting for her to believe she was worth following. By week 8, Deja and Colt were the most cohesive handler-dog team Serena had ever trained. Colt moved with Deja like an extension of her intention, and Deja moved with a steadiness and confidence that had been entirely absent in her first session. At the program's final graduation ceremony, Deja stood in front of the room with Colt sitting perfectly at her left side and gave a brief, fierce, unembellished speech in which she said that this program had not fixed her, but it had reminded her that she was not broken. The room had been very quiet for a moment after that. River, who had been lying beside Marcus near the back wall, lifted his head and looked directly at Serena. She looked back at him. She thought about a frozen riverbank and a dog left to die and a man who had stopped his truck on an icy morning because something made him stop. She understood, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, that the thread connecting all of these moments had been there all along. She simply had not been able to see it until she had healed enough to look. Serena Voss did not return to the Army. She had considered it briefly in the months after River Protocol launched, when several senior officers who had heard about the program reached out with expressions of interest and veiled suggestions about potential reserve roles or consulting positions. She had thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. And then she had decided that the most useful thing she could do with what she had learned was to stay exactly where she was and keep building what she had started. River Protocol expanded to 3 counties by the end of its first year, serving over 60 veterans across multiple cohorts, and received a formal partnership agreement with the VA regional office that Serena had spent 4 months negotiating with the same methodical precision she had once applied to targeting assessments. Dr. Osei became a full partner in the program. Marcus became its board chair. River became its unofficial mascot and continued to demonstrate, with patient and unhurried consistency, that a living creature rescued from impossible circumstances can go on to make impossible things happen. Deja Watkins enrolled in a veterinary technician program 6 months after completing River Protocol and came back to volunteer every Saturday morning. She told Serena once that she had started to believe that the accident that ended her military career had ended everything. Serena had told her that the things that end one chapter of our lives are almost always the first sentence of the next one. We do not always get to choose what breaks us, but we do get to choose what we build from what remains. Serena had learned this not from a manual or a therapist or a commanding officer. She had learned it from a poisoned dog on a frozen riverbank, from a man who stopped his truck when something told him to stop, and from the quiet, daily work of showing up for living things that were trying to find their way back to themselves. Military service teaches you to run toward danger. What it sometimes forgets to teach you is how to walk, slowly and with intention, toward the life waiting on the other side of it. Serena Voss had figured out how to do both, and in doing so, she had become something rarer than a decorated officer or a successful program director. She had become proof that the most important mission of a soldier's life sometimes begins the moment the uniform comes off, and that the most profound leadership is not the kind that commands others forward, but the kind that holds the door open and says, quietly and without condition, "I've been where you are. Follow me. There is still so much ahead."